Okay, sixth grade. Today we are going to talk about solving proportions. So I've got three examples for you here. And in a proportion, if you remember, it's when a fraction equals a fraction. Two ratios are equal to each other. And the difference now is we've got an equation because we've got a variable. So these are equations that we're going to solve. But because they're proportions, there's a special way to solve them. So when I look at my first example, it says 1/2 equals x over 8. So x is my variable. I'm trying to figure out what number x must be. Now some of you probably can look at this and you know the answer. But it's important to understand the process of how to solve a proportion because they're not always going to be that simple. To solve a proportion, what we do is we cross multiply. So we already talked about that when we were proving if two ratios made a proportion. If you remember, we cross multiplied. If we got the same number and they were equal, then yes, it was a proportion. If we got different numbers, then no, it was not. So in this case, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to cross multiply. We're going to multiply each diagonal. And when we do it, I always suggest starting with the diagonal that has the variable. The variable is the letter. So this diagonal right here, 2 times x is just 2x. And then my other diagonal, 1 times 8 is 8. And they are going to be equal to each other because we know that's how a proportion works. We already learned that. So now you can see we got a real simple equation. We learned how to solve one-step equations already. 2x equals 8. To solve this equation, all we do is we divide both sides by 2 because this is 2 times x equals 8. So we do the opposite, divide by 2, and we figure out that x equals 8 divided by 2 is 4. We've got our first answer. And we could check this by putting it back in here. Is 1/2 and 4/8 the same thing? Yes, they are. If I simplified 4/8, I'd get 1/2. So they're the same. All right, so let's look at our second one. 3/4 equals x over 10. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to cross multiply. So I'm going to start with the diagonal that has the variable. In this case, my x is there. So I'm doing 4 times x, which is just 4x. When you multiply a number times a variable, it's just going to be that number in front of the variable. Then over here, I've got 3 times 10, which is 30. And these are equal to each other. So 4x equals 30. Now I solve this, remember 4 times x, so I do the opposite and divide by 4. And you can see now we might end up with a decimal. It might not always come out even. 30 does not divide by 4 evenly. So if I come down here and I do that division, 4 doesn't go into 3, 4 goes into 37 times. 7 times 4 is 28, subtract, I get 2. I got to add a decimal and a 0 and bring that 0 down. I'm also going to bring my decimal up. 4 goes into 25 times. 5 times 4 is 20, subtract 0, we're done. So we got 7.5 as our answer, and that is possible. You could get a decimal. So 3/4 is equal to 7.5 over 10. All right, let's look at our last one. 4 over g equals 10 over 36. Still the same thing, even though it's maybe in a different form where the x isn't in the top right like the first two. It doesn't matter. You still do it the same way. You cross multiply. So I'm going to start with a diagonal that has my variable. My variable's the g. G times 10, I'm going to write that as 10g instead of g10. You always want the number before the variable. So 10g equals, over here, 36 times 4, was 144. Obviously, I could come off to the side and I could do that, check it, but I'm pretty positive it's 144. And now we just solve this 10 times g, so we do the opposite and divide by 10. So 144 divided by 10. Again, I could come down and do 144 divided by 10, but I know dividing by 10 is the same thing as moving the decimal one place to the left. So I know this is 14.4. And that is my answer. So to solve a proportion, all you do is cross multiply. And once you do that, you end up with just a one-step equation where you divide by the number in front of the x and you've got your answer. All right, you've got some practice problems to do. Do those, check them with the answer key, and then go into Google Classroom and do the Google form that is attached. Thank you.